How are you? My guest is Shireen Qudosi. She's with the Clarion Project. She also is with Islamic Reform. Shireen, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, my pleasure. Let's talk a little bit about the Islamic Reform movement, which I'm a big supporter of. I've interviewed Dr. Zudi Jassar in the past, and I guess that my question is: Does this is this movement making inroads outside the United States? Is it reaching Islamic countries, and is it impacting Islamic societies?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a global movement, and I would preface it by saying that this is not something that sprung out of our generation. This is historically ingrained within Islam to keep reforming itself, to keep changing and adapting and evolving, and often also regressing. So this sort of shift and change in Islam has been there since day one, and everyone can agree from Muhammad's first 12 years, and then thereafter, there was a big difference in how Islam was seen. And in the years after Muhammad's death, the wars that ensued, the growing empire, all of these changes have always brought sort of this ebb and flow of what Islam means. And that comes down to today. In today's time, we're still asking these really amazing questions of what does it mean to be a Muslim in the 21st century? What does Islam mean? And so this movement is embedded within our faith, and it's being asked, these questions are being asked by Muslims all over the world, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States.
And I think, as you say, what you're doing is you're promoting a very positive aspect of Islam, a moderate aspect. I think one of the people that I've heard speak on this is Sheikh Palazzi of Rome, who has talked about Islam as being a religion of peace. He recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel. And in fact, he calls for the people of the book, which is how the Quran refers to Jews, as being in that land in order to effect the coming of a messianic age, which I think is quite typical and similar to both a Christian and a Jewish view. And it's one that there was the king of Syria, bin al Hussein, Faisal, who signed the Faisal-Weizmann Accord in 1919, and who sought to bring Islamic countries, especially after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, into our modern age, where you would have them become more democratic and prosperous, and you develop all the institutions of freedom. And that to do that, he recognized the Palestine Mandate as a Jewish state in 1919, with the hope that this new state would work alongside Arab states as they became independent from European colonialism, and as a partnership, they would move into the modern world. So there certainly is a tradition of developing a more modern interpretation of Islam. And I congratulate you for being involved in it. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, by the way, here. But that's how I see it. But
Yeah, no, if I can comment,
please.
I would add that Palestine is really, it's become more of a political issue. It's not, it was never designed to be a religious issue. It's become hijacked as a religious issue. And in the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen this rise of this radical Islam. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this still a part of Islam? And I think we really conveniently distance ourselves from the sort of warring element of Islam, and it is part of our heritage. And so when we ask the question of, well, is Islam peace? Well, Islam actually means submission, and not a negative context, in a very positive sort of sense that you submit to some inherent truth, such as the sun will rise tomorrow. You don't question that. You don't rebel against that every day. So it's a submission to a higher order, a divine law, a divinity itself. But the question of whether Islam is peace, Islam doesn't actually mean peace. Islam, in the way that it's designed, is war and peace. And I think that's really critical point that we have to make in this day and age, because then what we end up doing is we end up distancing ourselves very conveniently from the sort of the smaller percentage, but still the very real percentage of Muslims who justify violence in the name of Islam. So to address the issue of radical Islam, terrorism, extremism, even the idea that these people aren't necessarily Muslim, we have to sort of start with the premise that Islam is both peace and war.
Well, I mean, generally, I think that the radical Islamic movement started to develop probably in earnest in the 1930s when you had the Nazis have an influence, and then after the defeat of the Nazis, it was the Soviets who entered into the picture. And they began to synthesize a radical form of Islam, which I don't think is the true religion. It was emphasizing the second half of the Quran, and it was emphasizing the warlike tendencies without the restraining tendencies that exist in the first half of the Quran.
Absolutely.
And I heard an interesting comment by Dinesh D'Souza. I don't know if you follow him, but he spoke at a conservative group where he said that radical Islam is a response to what has been a general decline of Islam over the past many, many centuries, starting with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Lepanto, and that this is an attempt to go back to a more muscular, stronger, empire-building aspect of Islam as a sort of a last gasp in what is generally a decline. What do you think of that?
Toxic masculinity in Islam, I think he's absolutely right. I had a fantastic conversation with Daniel Pipes recently where we discussed reform even in the 1830s, the 1800s, the late 1900s. And so the question of, what does Islam sort of regress to, the latter aspect of Muhammad's legacy is exactly that. It's a toxic version of Islam. It's Islam void of humanity, void of compassion, which is, I referenced the sheikh that you mentioned, the Italian sheikh, where we have to now come back to, well, let's sort of, reinvigorate Islam with the humanitarian aspect, Islam in the context of human rights. And so that's a very, very strong statement. I would actually agree with that, in that it has become more political, it has become more toxic in the last 2 generations because of the political response.
And also, it does seem to be this phenomena, and I cover this in my book, The Nazi Connection to Islamic Terrorism, where you have Western leaders, British, American, French, and the world and the international left, of course, particularly in the days of the Soviets, but even today, who tend to make common cause with the more radical elements of Islam. They tend to promote those elements, often at the expense of the more moderate and more westernized and more forward-thinking Islamic movement. And when I say westernized, I don't mean that in a chauvinistic sense. We're talking about universal themes that can be embraced by any religion. And certainly Christianity and Judaism didn't used to embrace these themes, but they do more so today. So the alliance between the more radical elements and the Western democracies, and particularly the international left, what do you make of that? Why are they finding such alliance? Why not support the more moderate elements?
There's a lot of theories for that. One being is we're seeing this sort of intersectionality of what can be on a superficial level or surface level seen as like-minded goals. So we see that with, for example, the leftist movements, and I don't mean liberals, I mean hard leftists, who are aligning themselves with anti-Semite Muslims or anti-Semitic Muslims or anti-Semite movements or Black nationalists. So we're seeing this sort of intersectionality, this sort of horrific Frankenstein of alliances between groups that are extremely radical in a certain sense, and then finding alliances in like-minded pockets of different communities, and then championing that as being some sort of movement. We saw this with Standing Rock, which is a movement that I actually support, but then we saw the Islamist Palestinian Front come in and try to hijack that. We're seeing that right now in a really active way with Black nationalists, with the Women's March, with anti-Semites. We're seeing that there was a protest in Germany where we had neo-Nazis with anti-Israeli activists, Muslim activists. And so that it sort of becomes an enemy. The enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, sort of a strategy. And it doesn't work, because what it comes down to is these agendas, these views, these positions are very hyper-focused on identity, and it's an identity that's constructed. It's not an identity that's explored, and that's essentially what reform is about, is how do you look at what it means to be a Muslim in a radically honest way that doesn't rely on the sort of pre-packaged mold that we've been born into, or that we inherit from propagandists like Linda Sarsour, and now a couple of our elected representatives in Congress. How can we really question what it means to be Muslim? How can we really question what it means to have any identity that we're sort of boxed into by larger groups or organizations, whether they're religions, whether they're political, whether they're of other ideologies.
Well, that is the question. My guest is Shireen Qudosi, and she's with the Clarion Project and the Muslim Reform Movement. Shireen, I think that from my observation, it seems that some of the more radical elements in this country are the ones that get promoted. You mentioned Linda Sarsour. I would include in that CARE and ISNA and some of the other groups which tend to be affiliated with Muslim Brotherhood and who tend to be, not of the more moderate type of leaders, like, for example, El-Sisi of Egypt, who I think is more of a moderate, and King Hussein of Jordan. Whenever there's any news about Islam, the media goes to those groups, not someone like you. How pervasive, how much do they represent or speak for the American Muslim community today, and how is it that they have achieved this kind of high ground in our culture and as spokespeople for Islam in America?
Well, they achieve the high ground because they keep getting the media coverage. And so, for example, when we look at Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, we look at Linda Sarsour, they continually get that coverage. And part of that goes back to the intersectionality. They've been really, really effective in aligning themselves with groups that can further build their platform, further advance their representation in the media. But what happens is that these individuals don't represent the larger Muslim public. So, for example, with Linda Sarsour, there are so many Muslims who actually don't support her. I spoke with an African-American female imam in San Francisco, Rabia Keeble, who actually is not a fan of Linda Sarsour at all, even though she's a Democrat, she's a female, an imam, a feminist, and you would think those people would align, but they're not. But she's not going to get represented in the media because it's not part of the convenient narrative, just like we're not going to get represented in the media as reformers because we're not part of that convenient narrative of what it means to be a Muslim. And that, I want to stress, is a real disadvantage to us, because when the next terror attack happens, which unfortunately, God forbid, I hope it doesn't, but it's inevitable at this point because there's only so many holes you can plug in any given problem. When the next attack happens, whether it's here, whether it's in some other part of the world, we're going to sit there and have our change our avatars and have our candles and our prayers and et cetera, et cetera. And it's become this sort of grievance fetish, the fetish of grieving disaster, versus let's look at what we can actually do to prevent that disaster from happening in the first place. And that means empowering folks like myself and my allies and other like-minded colleagues who are challenging what it means to be a Muslim in the 21st century. And that starts with radically honest dialogues. That doesn't start with calling for jihad against the President of the United States. It doesn't call for telling people to dehumanize Israelis. That calls for being compassionate and empathetic and humane. And apparently that doesn't really make the headlines today.
Well, you mentioned intersectionality between the more radical elements in Islam and the more radical elements in this country, in the West. And the strange thing about that is that, the more radicals like maybe Linda Sarsour or whoever are making common cause with women's organizations and women's groups, and yet these same radicals on the Islamic side are not exactly respectful toward women's rights. They make common cause with gay groups. They're not all that respectful toward gay rights. And yet, there seems to be some kind of a disconnect there. I mean, why don't they understand that? How can they be intersecting with people who actually would be the exact opposite of what they believe in and the way they see the world?
We're in a culture, unfortunately, that has a problem with attention deficit disorder, and what looks good, what sounds good, what's sort of shiny and noisy gets the most attention. So we can look at the Women's March, for example. Off the bat, right now we're talking about the anti-Semitism in the Women's March, and the Women's March is crumbling because of the attention that issue has gotten through folks like Alyssa Milano, a celebrity activist who was involved initially in the Women's March on some level. But if we sort of rewind back to the start of the Women's March, this is a conversation we were having in 2017. We were talking about the anti-feminist sort of disposition of the Women's March, and they were actively pushing out women who were pro-life. They were actively pushing out women who did not sort of subscribe to the checkbox list of what it means to be a feminist in the 21st century. And so that's what we have to start paying more attention to, is what are the red flags that are popping up at the start of a movement. And moreover, whenever something like a women's march, or right now we have, for example, the trans movement, whenever these movements skyrocket overnight, that should be a big red flag for any American, because movements like that don't skyrocket overnight. It's very, very rare. And so we have to look at who's getting funded, where's the money coming from, where's the organizations coming from, and so that we're more aware of the agenda behind whatever fad movement has made the headlines today.
Well, I mean, I think that it's safe to say that at least to a pretty large degree, the Women's March movement has been co-opted by the radical left, and that they don't care about women's rights. They're interested in power. They're interested in promoting themselves. I mean, a perfect example would be the rally right after the election, the inauguration of President Trump. They told women who were not on their side, women who were conservative, who wanted to come out and show support for women, that they were not invited, that they had to leave. I mean, so I think that the true colors are there with that. If there is, God forbid, another terrorist incident, and we're reaching toward the end of the interview, but is there a way we can make sure that we can identify the nature of the terrorism and the radical element there, while at the same time honoring and fostering Muslim fellow citizens in this country who want to come out and condemn that, and who want to support a more moderate version of their faith?
What I look at is, and what I tell people is just, this is a very complicated issue, and right now my sympathy goes out to folks who are bombarded with issue after issue. So I want to keep a very clear visual for folks, and that is the conveyor belt. The conveyor belt of radicalization. What Muslim reformers are doing is trying to destroy the conveyor belt, the thing that radicalizes an individual from youth, manipulates them, lies to them, and then gives them a false sense of identity, and then pushes them towards becoming a jihadi. We want to destroy that conveyor belt. And now there are other programs like Clarion Project's Preventing Violent Extremism program that are looking to prevent folks from even getting on that conveyor belt. And so that's going to be really important. And that starts with empowering educators, lawmakers, parents, politicians, whoever you can think of, psychologists, so that we're aware of what are the warning signs for radicalization extremism on any level, whether that's neo-Nazis, whether that's jihadis, whether that's black, whatever it may be, is we need to empower ourselves so that we're aware of when our kids from day one are veering onto that conveyor belt, so that we can prevent that conveyor belt from even being churned.
Well, very good, and it's an excellent strategy. It's an excellent tactic. It makes perfect sense, which is why I hope that I hope it gets across. I hope people hear that. Shireen Qudosi, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Please let my listeners and viewers know where they could get more information about you and about your group.
Absolutely. So head over to clarionproject.org, and the homepage has new articles from me every single day. It also has more information about our Preventing Violent Extremism program. We will come to anybody in the U.S. and give a presentation, whatever industry you're in. We will talk to you. We will give you a free presentation so that you are informed with the tools that you need to prevent violent extremism in your community.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.